Her research interests include the distributional impacts of trade and financial liberalization as they are mediated by politics and institutions. Let's keep counting because this is interest number one. Interest number two is the politics of trade agreements involving developing economies and the causes and effects of democracy in globalizing developing nations. She's published in so many articles. I'm not going to name them for you. Her current projects analyze how and why widespread poverty persists in rapidly globalizing economies, the politics of supporting resisting changes to the informal sector, and the anti-globalization backlash, and the politics of trade and trade agreements. Nita, please come to the podium.
I'm going to make you think. Shanghai, that's a good guess. Feasible. Anyone? It's hard, right? Because that looks like it could be any big city in the US. People have guessed Chicago. People have guessed Shanghai. It could be in any rich or poor countries. So this is a landscape of the city of Mumbai. Who said that? You did? Oh, okay. All right. Melanie wins. It is Mumbai. All right? This is the landscape of Mumbai. There's nothing that unique about it. What I do want to point out, though, is this particular structure. This one here. Have you seen this structure before? Can you want to take a guess what corporation, what that structure represents? No? That's right. It is not a corporation. This is the most expensive house in the world. Yes, it belongs to Mukesh Ambani. It costs $1 billion. It has 200 parking spaces, I don't know how many floors, 600 staff members, an indoor cinema, temples. I mean, I could go on, right? This made the front page of the New York Times when it was built. So Mukesh Ambani is the chairman of Reliance Limited, which is the biggest corporation, one of the biggest corporations in the world, definitely in India. And Reliance Limited does business with telecommunications, natural resources, petrochemicals, textiles, the gambit. Well, Reliance Limited had existed for a long time. So before India liberalized, they were doing pretty well. But then after they liberalized, we see this, right? They have skyrocketed. And much of this comes from India's liberalization. They contribute 7% of India's exports, which is a really high number, and their revenue itself is made up, 20% of their revenue comes from exports. So Mukesh Ambani Reliance Limited is an exemplar of how private industry and private entrepreneurs have done extremely well in countries like India since liberalization. And you can see here that India has been liberalizing. Their GDP growth has been often compared to China. It's now between 6, 7, 8%, and it's held pretty steady. Now, this graph is deceptive because it starts in 1990. India started liberalizing in 1991 is when it had its Big Bang industrialization. So the top graph represents its growth trends, which has been remarkably high since they liberalized. Now, prior to that, India had what they call the Hindu rate of growth. They were stuck for decades since independence, which was in the mid-1940s, and they adopted, just like Egypt, the ISI policies, import substitution, industrialization, where they're very protectionist and they didn't trade with other countries, and they were stuck at what was called the Hindu rate of growth, which was 1%. So it's pretty remarkable how much India has grown since liberalization. And as you can see, this left graph represents their FDI flows and the right their trade flows. It took a little bit of time to take off, right? Because also similar to Egypt, that they had much resistance. There was a lot of political coalitions that weren't too excited about liberalization because they associated it with imperial powers. But towards the early 2000s, and that spike there was just because of the recession, but around the early 2000s, you see that India really started to embrace foreign investment and exports and allow more imports to their country. So India's doing pretty well. They've had pretty recently their first restaurant week. I mean, this is also in Mumbai. I mean, wouldn't you like to go to this restaurant? I would like to go to this restaurant. It's pretty fabulous, right? At the same time, this is really where most of India lives, right? This is, I mean, estimates vary, but 70 to 80% of the population. This is really how most Indians live, which is different than, I live in Washington, D.C., when you hear about India doing so well, and China and the Asian tigers, and we think about the other picture of India as really profiting from liberalization. But there is this, definitely, the reality that accompanies liberalization. And India is not unique, right? This juxtaposition between rich and poor is prevalent in both rich and poor countries, right? Of course, there's variation within regions and variations among countries, but as a general trend, I'm not going to say correlation equals causation, but we definitely see rising inequality in many countries that have been liberalizing. So definitely in the high-income countries, but what many people don't know that study rich democracies is that in developing countries too, inequality has been increasing pretty remarkably in many countries. And from what I understand, this is the case in Egypt as well. So if you look at the Gini coefficient, as I'm sure you know, in Egypt it's very low. But recent scholars have taken issue with the way the Gini coefficient is measured, and what many of them that I see are saying is that there is some issue with the measurement, and what they've turned to is survey research to get a sense of rising inequality in Egypt, which I can even see is palpable just on my 2 or 3 days here, just the difference between old and new Cairo. And even just talking to the taxi drivers are very remark that they feel that the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. So in this graph, this is from World Value Survey data. The blue bar represents 2000, around the survey taken in 2000, and then 2012 is the yellow bar. And what you can see in Egypt, the question is some level of inequality good for encouraging people to work harder? And as you can see that respondents in Egypt feel this is more and more less and less acceptable, that inequality is becoming too large and mask any types of incentivizing that higher inequality can give. And this other question where you definitely see a marked increase, especially over time, as Egypt also has been liberalizing, is more and more respondents are saying, income inequality should be a goal that governments have. So this is actually a quite surprising trend. If there's one conference that has had the biggest impact on the global economy, aside this one, of course, is the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. There were 44 delegates from all over the world, both rich and poor countries. Many people think that it was just the industrialized countries that attended this conference, but it included many members in the developing world, including countries like China and Brazil. And these delegates got together in 1944 to prevent exactly those trends that I just described, rising liberalization with effectively rising inequality. And why? Is because they were coming from the heels of the Great Depression and the devastation of World War II, when the economy was in shambles and when both rich and poor were feeling the aftermath of what happens when countries just focus inwardly, right? When they focus on things like import substitution, industrialization, greater protectionism. So what they vowed, in order to prevent things like the Great Depression, in order to rebuild the global economy, they settled, as a delegation, the consensus on two very important principles. One is that they were going to revive free trade, and there was going to be an emphasis on multilateralism and pursuing an open market economy. But this was going to be tempered with the government's ability and acceptability and a broad, what John Ruggie eventually called embedded liberal compromise, a social purpose that governments should be allowed to intervene in the economy to curb the excesses of an open market economy. So the idea was, yes, we'll pursue free trade, but that's not going to be our national priority. Our national priority is going to be taking care of our domestic social needs. And we're going to do that alongside free trade. Because if we don't, there's going to be a backlash against globalization. So not only is there going to be instability, but then those who are the losers of globalization are going to resist open markets, and they're going to demand protectionism again, and we're going to go full circle in history and go back to the era of the Great Depression. And many people like Karl Polanyi, who Melanie talked about yesterday, also argued it created World War I, right? This drive for markets. And yet, we see this happening all over the world, but especially concentrated in rich countries. So what happened to this Bretton Woods compromise that these 44 delegates agreed upon, that in order for there to be open markets and inequality to be kept at a reasonable level, and to prevent a backlash from globalization, governments should be intervening in their economy to prevent this kind of thing. And yet we see more and more protests in both rich and poor countries. But especially we've seen this with Trump's trade policies, with Brexit, that there is a resistance among the average voter, the median voter, towards globalization. Well, there's some explanations for that. So many scholars, including myself, have been very vested in understanding this embedded liberal compromise. My own work, I focused on how much are developing countries, have they actually adopted in practice an embedded liberal compromise. And most of this research shows that it's actually a large number of, the majority actually argue, that most countries have been engaging in the embedded liberal compromise. In other words, they've been following the principles set out by the 1944 delegation at Bretton Woods. They've been pursuing open markets, and they've been investing in the welfare state to help compensate those who are injured from globalization. Well, then that raises a puzzle, because we're seeing this pushback. If that's the case, why are we seeing this pushback against globalization? Well, there's another set of scholars, Kate McNamara, Mark Blythe, many others, who argued, well, actually, there has been a disembedding of liberalization that's going on, that there has been a pushback, especially ideologically, against governments from intervening in the economy. And so therefore, this explains why, ostensibly, why there's been a backlash against globalization, because governments are not intervening in the economy to protect those losers of globalization. So there's a tension here between these two sets of scholarship. One set of scholarship shows governments have been investing in trying to help protect their citizens as they liberalize. Another set of scholarship saying, actually, there has been a change in ideas towards more neoliberalism. I think both are right. Okay, but there's other studies too, I don't want to gloss over that. There's other scholars that have tried to explain this anti-globalization, this globalization backlash that has been riveting the global economy in many, many countries throughout the world, this rise of populism. And the explanation they come out, the general explanation is there's a rise in racism, right? They associate trade and foreign investment with the influence of outsiders, so people are pushing back against them. I ask why now, but this is the probably most predominant explanation for the anti-globalization backlash, ignoring the whole inequality part. The second is that international institutions like the World Bank, but especially the WTO, had gained too much power. The European Union, and so states are pushing back against that because their sovereignty has been upended. There's a decline in trade union and the manufacturing sector, so not as many people pushing for more state intervention. And then, of course, the rise of austerity policies, like what we've been seeing in Egypt. But what we argue, Ed Mansfield and I have written a piece that actually there is an additional factor, not that all of these elements may well be true, but one factor that hasn't been emphasized enough, which brings me here today to the Social Policy Conference, is actually not the failure of embedded liberalism, but I'm going to argue it's the success of embedded liberalism that's created this hyper-globalization and this The success of embedded liberalism has created this embeddedness. And fundamentally, the digital revolution that is related to that. And as a consequence, I'm going to argue that the success of embedded liberalism has made embedded liberalism, at least the old bargain, obsolete. So while these last few days you've given excellent presentations on conditional cash transfers and Social Security policies for the informal sector and food subsidies, all those are important. But I'm going to argue that in the current global economy, that what that's going to do, important as it is from keeping people from falling to the bottom, but it could exacerbate, and it's definitely not going to help solve the problem of closing the gap between the rich and the poor, that gap is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So what we really need to do is we need to, in addition to everything that you've talked about today, we need to rethink the welfare state. So how am I going to do that? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the digital revolution, how it relates to empowering certain actors in the global economy that is creating pressures on the old welfare state bargain. And fundamentally, the reason why those forces have emerged are rooted in politics and not economics. And that is contrary to conventional wisdom, where we think about these evolutions in science and technology as spontaneous developments in the private sector or market innovation. I'm going to argue, actually, it's rooted in politics and government intervention. And these together have put these strains on the safety net as we know it, as we knew it, as the Bretton Woods 44 delegates thought about it in 1944. The welfare state then, that welfare state, it was good then, and the ones that we're talking about are also important, but they're not sufficient to meet the demands of the global economy today. So what happened? 1970s, I would argue, is the main turning point for the digital revolution, right? And this is what the industrial titans call the third revolution. It was a shift from what they call a mechanical and analog technology to digital ICT, or information communication technology. That's a bunch of jargon. So what does that mean? ICT, information communication technology, is what they call a general purpose technology. Every industrial revolution has been driven by some sort of general purpose technology. The first one in the 18th century was driven by steam power and combustible energy. The second one, mass production, was driven by electricity. And the third one is driven by digital ICT. So what does that mean? The move to digital technology has propelled the pace of technological change. And what it has fundamentally done, it has done many things. It's made our lives better in many ways. All of us are sitting here with our iPhones and connecting to people from all over the world and doing work simultaneously. But what it's really done, most importantly for our purposes today, is it's created a different type of global economy. The type of trade and the type of investment that existed during the 1944 Bretton Woods is very different than the way trade and investment is conducted globally today. And this is because of digital ICT. What it has done is it has fed the proliferation of supply chains, global supply chains, where firms can now unbundle all the different production, fragment out the production process at geographically distant locations throughout the world in a more efficient and cost-effective manner. Now, supply chains have existed for centuries, right? But the difference today is not only because it's the production process per se that's fragmented, but also because we're taking developed country technology and we're combining it with developing country low-cost labor. So now this is involving both rich and poor countries. And so what this has done is has really emboldened and given particularly policy leverage to multinational companies, which are the most productive firms. So we know that multinational companies have always had disproportional economic, and I would argue political power, but the way in which they exercise policy influence is very different in the digital economy with the proliferation of global supply chain. Because now I can do management. The transaction costs of managing intra-firm and inter-firm operations, as well as doing the production costs, is as well as engaging in trade, which is now more within firm trade, is very different. So by combining these developed economy technology, so these firms are trading within themselves, so they're not necessarily sharing their technology the same way, but it is giving more and more advantage to exporting or multinational firms, because they're the firms that have the export revenues, because it costs money to export, right? There's transportation costs, there's logistics, there's management. So these particular multinational firms have the economic leverage to be able to engage in export. And so there's this vicious cycle that occurs by getting these extra revenues. They then in turn invest that in technological upgrades. So with digital economy, you have the spread of these global supply chains, which can manage their production operations in a much more efficient way, so that fewer firms can independently operate in the global economy without being connected to this global supply chain network that is being led by multinational firms. So there's been pretty surprising statistics that have been released by the World Trade Organization, and this is by UNCTAD, that 80% of trade now occurs in these value chains, led by multinational companies, and these companies are a smaller and smaller number of companies. So this is just a small insight into the enormous economic and political power that multinationals, and what Danny Roderick calls engage in hyper-globalization because of the enormous political and economic power that they wield. Now, this is not just a spontaneous, so just to give you an example of the power of digital technology and why this is so impactful in creating a global economy that's very different than the one that existed post-World War II during Bretton Woods. This is what the industry calls Moore's Law, right? Very technically, it means it's the number of transistors that are located on a circuit chip. And what Moore predicted in the 1950s is this was going to double every 2 years. So this is exponential growth. Right? And so as you can see by this graph, that in time, so this is used as a proxy for technological progress based on digital technology. So what's different now too is the pace of technological progress, right? And you can see that is very profound compared to 1970, and look at it compared to the late 2000s. Now, there is a digital divide, but we can't make the mistake of thinking that this is just a story about the developed world. This is very much a story about the developing world too. This was taken from a World Development Report, where you can see the dark green line represents, these are examples of digital technology, is the mobile phone. The dotted line is the internet, and mobile broadband is the green polka dotted line. And so what you can see is advances in digital technology are taking over water, electricity, sanitation, a lot of the factors that we're talking about today. Now, I want to take a step back and argue that as much of this seems like it's a story about these natural evolution of the global economy, I want to keep the story centered on embedded liberalism and the political agreements that were made in 1944 to prevent this kind of thing from happening. So the embedded liberalism, although it was included both developed and developing country, in effect, it included the developed world. It was focused on making sure that the developed world did two things: that they engaged in promoting policies that would advance the global market economy, and at the same time that they would engage in state intervention, and that they would they would maintain a welfare state to help curb the excesses, to protect the losers of globalization. So that second part was not focused on the developing countries, because in the 1950s, everything changed with the Cold War. And up until the 1950s, Eric Heliner points out that developing countries were very much part of the embedded liberalism discussion, the debate, the compromise. But in the 1950s, everything changed with the onset of Cold War. Now, developing countries were being pushed from the fear of communism and the interest in security to adopt much more orthodox policies, which was very different than what developed countries were being urged to pursue. So now you have international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, these Bretton Woods institutions that are now promoting the opposite of embedded liberalism in the developing world, but promoting embedded liberalism in the developed world. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because during this time period in the post-war era, with the Marshall Plan, foreign aid that's focused on, and the World Bank, the IMF, we're creating a global economy architecture that is promoting open markets, especially in developed and developing countries, but with not allowing developing countries, not that we were doing that anyway, but to pursue the embedded liberal compromise. Of course, we know that in developing countries, they were protecting labor, but it was a very, very small elite segment of the labor force. The broader labor force is unprotected. So with these IMF programs, these emphasis on free market orthodoxy, what happened now is what we are doing in a global sense is we're unleashing a supply of global unprotected labor, right? So cheap labor, right? That's all the non-elite labor groups, which is the majority in developing countries, were not subject to the embedded liberal compromise. So you have a global market that's expanding, and you also are increasing the supply of cheap, unprotected labor that's coming from the developing world. And taking that together, at the same time, there was something else that was happening in the global economy centered on the US that played a huge role in the digital revolution that is often overlooked, or actually not really talked about at all, right? And this was the US's role in promoting the digital revolution, right? These were government policy. Prior to World War II, there was no national policy in the US towards technology. In fact, governments, it's not that the government didn't help with technological innovations and science, we know that they did, but there was no systematic policy. In fact, industry viewed the government as and the public did as well, as the enemy of science. But all that changed after World War II. When President Truman came to power, they asked to develop a national science technology. And they did this for three reasons. One, of course, was security. The other was to serve the basic needs of the population, because they were very much worried about disease and health, and they knew that the government had to take an active role in promoting better health standards and controlling these diseases. And the third is they recognized that they needed technology in order to be competitive in the global economy. So with this policy in mind, the government took a very, very active role in technological development. They developed something called ARPA. Some of you might have heard of that, the Advanced Research Protection Agency. So ARPA actually is fundamentally responsible for developing what they called at that time the ARPANET, right? It was the government's effort, the government's intervention that developed what became the internet, and the protocols, the ability for computers to talk to each other through these networks were developed fundamentally by the US government. And so without the internet and the digital technology might have been developed, but we wouldn't have had the digital revolution. You can't have a digital revolution without the internet. So fundamentally, the government's launching of the computer industry and the internet set the stage for the digital revolution. And in this way, this effort by the US government played a fundamental role in what we call a hyperglobalization, or this new global economy that's defined by this proliferation of supply chains. Okay, so taken together, this is what we have, right? We have the rich democracies promoted multilateralism in both rich and poor countries, open markets, and they heavily invested in technology. So state intervention, that was also part of the principles of embedded liberalism, directed towards technology. These two together helped support the 1970s digital revolution that included both open markets for developed and developing countries, because the global supply chains would not operate the way they did today if developing countries didn't liberalize and if they didn't have large supply of low-cost labor. And with these extensive policy interdependence of these global supply chains gives rise to these multinationals that have disproportionate economic and political power. And taken together, this digital revolution, and that's where it brings me today to this conference, produces new strains on workers, which the welfare states that were thought of and developed starting in 1945 deal with. Right? These are new strains, and that's why I said that those scholars who are finding that, yes, many countries are accompanying liberalization with greater state intervention and compensation for the injured, and then we have another group of scholars that are saying, no, there's more disembeddedness going on. I'm going to argue it's both. I'm arguing that it's both, that they are spending more, many, not all, are maintaining their welfare states, but they're not fitting the needs of the digital economy. Right? So in that sense, it is being disembedded. So what are these new social strains? I'm going to discuss three main social strains. The first is with the digital revolution, the global supply chains. It's really extraordinarily difficult to regulate both labor and capital. Why? Going back to the multinationals, right? It's not just the lead. Before, governments could command control over individual firms. Now they're trying to command and control individual firms that are connected to many different firms throughout the global economy. So that if firms don't, so what you have is arbitrage. If firms don't like the policies of the government in one, if the multinational doesn't like the policies of the government in one section of their supply chain, they can optimize their supply chain so that they can relocate their main production in government and countries in which they do like their policies, right? So scholars like Henry Peril and my colleague at Georgetown, Abe Newman, have argued that the level of policy interdependence today because of this global supply chain network is unprecedented. And so what this means for the welfare state is it becomes particularly difficult to regulate capital and labor. Capital, because it's extremely difficult for them to tax, both legally and illegally. Legally by what they call transfer pricing, where we can just shift the main, we can create the taxation revenue in places where the production is not taking place. That's legal means, and of course there's illegal means that we can, loopholes that we can take advantage of in the global economy. And the same thing with labor protections. If country A, if Egypt wants to increase its labor protections, but it's lobbying for access to coveted global supply chains, and India lowers its labor protections, then why not, then we're going to lose out, right? So labor becomes much more, not that it wasn't hard before, but now in the digital global economy, much more difficult to regulate. The second is the consequences on less skilled labor, right? Now, what's important here, as I said, this is the third industrial revolution. The first two actually involved a de-skilling of labor. What that means is demand for skilled labor actually decreased with those industrial revolutions. Why? Because with mass production, you had skilled artisans being replaced by factory laborers that had much lower levels of education. So actually, in the previous industrial revolutions, the demand for unskilled workers increased, which makes sense when you look at wage data, because wages were increasing, at least up until the 1970s. But it is particularly the digital revolution that has changed that in a way that is unique compared to other digital revolution, right? The demand with this global supply chain and multinationals bringing in this technology and the demands that keeping up with Moore's law requires is a higher level of skill set, higher level of, even in labor-intensive production. So many people don't realize this, that even in developing countries we see this to be the case, that there's higher and higher demand for skilled labor. Low-skilled workers are still doing well. They have improved with liberalization, but the amount, the proportional gain among skilled workers far exceeds the gain that low-skilled workers have been achieving. So this graph by the World Bank in 2016, I think, says it all. So for those of you who studied advanced industrialized countries, it's become very well known, David Otter's work, that there's been what they call I think that's the name of his article, a hollowing out of the middle. that with digitalization and this increasing demand for skilled labor and this constant technological progress and this effort to keep up, and automation, that the jobs are going to the skilled workers, right? The middle skilled workers are being replaced by computers, and the middle skilled are like office workers, filers, technicians, that those jobs are being automated. So what happens? Most of them, at least the researchers, doesn't go and get reskilled, although they could. Most of them join the low-skilled workers. Now, their jobs are still intact, so that's the good news. So there's the sweepers and the low-skilled service sector jobs, right, are still intact. But the problem with their jobs is their wages aren't increasing. So while they're keeping their employment, middle-skilled workers are joining that labor force and putting pressure on wages. The high-skilled workers, their wages are rapidly increasing. And so what the World Bank report shows us, they take that same methodology, and to the surprise of many, especially in rich countries, is you're seeing the same hollowing out in the developing world. It's hard to see, but the dark lines represent skilled labor. The red lines with the negative drop are the middle-skilled workers, and the gray line, the darker gray line is the low-skilled workers. All right, and finally, the third social strain, it's a different type of anxiety that we anticipate that workers are facing in the digital economy. It's different than losing your job because of import competition or foreign investment, where we've lost our jobs, so we need more Social Security benefits, we need unemployment benefits. What we're seeing is that there's going to be more anticipation of future socioeconomic progress. How to move from one socioeconomic status to the next socioeconomic status, which previous generations, at least in rich countries, could do, right? But now, especially in rich countries, but also in some poor countries, it is much more difficult to change your socioeconomic status than it was pre-industrial revolution. So this is, a lot of economists and behavioral economists have looked at this, that what they call the POUN, the prospects of upward mobility, can be a very strong predictor of how you evaluate your political incumbents. It can be a very strong predictor of whether or not you support certain policies. So we think that it can also be a strong predictor of being susceptible to narratives. You know, if I feel like I'm not progressing, I'm working really hard, I have a job. So Melanie's presentation yesterday, she showed the survey that people, what was the one thing that they really desired? It wasn't social services, it was getting a job, right? So it's not the unemployment benefit, that matters, but really that doesn't matter as much to me as having a job. So what could be happening in terms of the digital economy contributing to this anti-globalization backlash is that they're worried about their future, right? The existing surveys don't capture this, right? That they feel like they've been working really, really hard and they're not getting ahead, and they become susceptible to elite narratives that it's trade's fault or it's foreigners' fault that we're not working hard. So they become much more susceptible to these narratives of what is causing their anxiety. Interestingly, the rising inequality narrative that at least in the US that Bernie Sanders used didn't work. But it's trade's fault, not the rich corporation's fault, that didn't work, but it's trade's fault and other countries' fault, that did work. So ultimately, taking all this together, what we're arguing is that the new welfare state, we do need to, of course, worry about conditional cash transfers and unemployment and social insurance, but we also have to incorporate the problem of the rising skill premium, right? And the fact that there's going to be more and more low-skilled workers whose wages are ultimately, in developed countries, have already stagnated, and in developing countries are ultimately going to stagnate with the rise of automation and technological progress. And so this was at the World Economic Forum just this last year. They did a survey of global executives. So this is executives all over the world. And what they found is quite some startling statements, right? They said that employers expect no less than 54% of all workers will require significant reskilling and upskilling by 2022. And that 14% of the workforce will have to change careers because of automation and artificial intelligence. And the majority of executives argued that they will either have to retrain or replace more of a quarter of their workforce by 2023. And 2/3 argued that you have to constantly reskill and upskill as a top priority. So, taking it all together, this is the heart of the angst. Klaus Schwab said, chairman of the World Economic Forum, "I am convinced of one thing, that in the future, talent more than capital will represent the critical factor of production. This will give rise to a job market increasingly segregated into less skill, low pay, with or without social insurance benefits, and high skill, high pay segments, which in turn will lead to an increase in social tensions." So to conclude, we're calling for a new social compact, one that takes into account everything that you've talked about these last 2 days, but in addition, focuses on reskilling and upskilling, the demands of the digital era. So active labor market policies, many of you also talked about that today, yesterday especially, but ones that work, ones that are training people to actually get jobs that are important in the digital economy. And in this type of environment, we're less likely to see this backlash against globalization, because if individuals see that social upward mobility is still a prospect, then they're more likely to be accepting of existing political or especially economic policies. And also what this tells us, the story about the digital revolution, this hybrid globalization, is an outgrowth of the success of embedded liberalism and not its lack of success or its unraveling, is that if government started this mess, especially in the US, then it's also their responsibility to help clean it up. In other words, we can't just think about compensating people for import competition, right? Or foreign investments that roots out less efficient domestic firms. We also have to think about helping compensating individuals for changes in technology, right? That's not part of the dialogue. That's not part of the calculated policies towards redistribution in rich or poor countries. And finally, we have to incorporate, because of the way the global supply chain works, we have to incorporate and incentivize in some way how we could get lead firms or the multinationals to cooperate in these types of social welfare policies. Because ultimately, we don't want to live in a world, as Danny Roderick put it, where international economic integration leads to social disintegration. We want to lead in a world in which international economic integration leads to social integration. I want to thank our hosts. Thank you, Rana and Gada and everyone else that invited us, Melanie and I, and meeting and talking to all of you. It's been a great experience. It's my first, I studied developing economies. I look at a lot of South Asia and Latin America. It's my first visit to Egypt, and I think it's fabulous. I see inequalities increasing. It's a problem. But it's an exciting place to be with lots of potential, and it's wonderful meeting scholars like you. So thank you so much.